if you could introduce it, George, because I'm just finishing this food. Sorry, mate.
Okay, this is George Lees, Professor George Lees, talking to John Patterson, and we talked earlier today about the El Nino concept, and what I talked about was a complete surprise to John, because John understands that El Nino in modern day parlance.
You've cut off, mate.
Ah, okay.
Completely. I can't hear you.
Well, okay, my microphone's laid down. Is that better?
You're back now, yeah.
Yeah, so that was not a conspiracy. That was just me laid the microphone down. Okay, so this is George Lees talking to John Patterson, and what we talked about this morning was El Nino. Now, John Patterson recognises that we have global warming, and John Patterson believed until this morning that El Nino was just the bizarre weather patterns that we get across the globe, and we talked particularly about the South Pacific. And I want to explain to John and to the world that El Nino is actually, the original El Nino is actually a religious icon of the baby Jesus. So it's a little statuette, and I'm now going to put up on my computer screen the Google images of that, and I'm looking at that with my camera now, and you can see El Nino, you can see the crucifix, you can see the baby Jesus in the crib, you can see the Virgin Mary holding up the baby Jesus, holding up the Holy Grail, and you can see all of the iconic Christian artifacts that were taken. There in particular, I'm pointing now at the most famous one, a little tiny little doll, like a Cindy doll. Some of them are picturing the baby Jesus with a crown on, some are just images in a cradle or in the Bethlehem stable. And it is quite obvious that when Christianity went to the South Pacific, where it was taken there by a chap called Magellan, everybody will have heard of Magellan, the famous explorer. He circumnavigated the globe. He took 3 ships with him, and I think the attrition rate and the violence en route was enough so that only about 20% of his crews on those 3 ships returned to Europe. So John was quite surprised that El Nino, the original El Nino, is the baby Jesus. And what happened when those explorers arrived in the South Pacific was they went to the beachhead. The natives were completely fascinated by the white man appearing, and because they had these little icons, they were able to trade them for strings of pearls, gold, silver, all the artifacts that were on the islands, and it made the visitors look iconic, and it launched the religious concept that, when the sexual favours were given and the next generation of global explorers' children were born, then you had the launch of Christianity big time. And the missions since then have relentlessly sold the Christianity concept, so that almost every pagan nation on the globe has had its indigenous peoples culled. Do you realise the gravity of that, John?
The thing is, George, I've said this before, with stuff that you and Gordon have been putting out.
Well, don't mention Gordon, because Gordon would not like to be associated with a conspiracy theory like this.
I was talking about the other one, but it doesn't matter, we won't mention him. You can understand why they were trying to stop us recording today, all that messing around, but this is incredible stuff, George.
So there's images now on my screen in front of my...
Yeah, just mention, George, that we're both recording this, and I don't have your images.
Yeah, it's just that mine will be available, and what I'm showing now is the images of the battle between the indigenous peoples and Magellan's invading forces. Now the man who became a legend in the South Pacific for the indigenous people was called Lapu Lapu. And he took on Magellan's forces with gunpowder and guns. He killed Magellan on a beach in the Battle of Mactan with a sword. Okay, so you've got the technology coming in from Europe, you've got the religion coming in from Europe, and you've got the natives poorly armed against, you know, people in armour, and the images on the beach. Now what I want to tell you about now is the thing that Gordon Bowden would see as a conspiracy theory, because I believe that every message we get from God, the acts of God that we talk about in the weather patterns that we see, are actually a reflection about human behaviours. And when Christianity swept, and I've explained to you how Christianity and the New Testament and the life of Jesus Christ was actually a fraud, written by the Piso family in Naples, in the Villa Papyri, which was buried in rubble and ashes when Vesuvius exploded in 79 AD. And I've explained to you the need for the time shift and the deployment of the time travel team and the TARDIS, and I've showed you how the New World Order and the profiteers laugh at that concept, because the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, where the Basel faulty joke was launched by John Cleese, who's now in the tax havens, but the Bank of International Settlements looks just like a Dalek.
Exactly.
Yeah, so to compensate for the time difference between the birth of the mythical Jesus and the release of that story in 79 AD, the jokers that control the world for 2,000 years introduced the concept of time travel, and they made the Bank of International Settlements look like the Dalek, or vice versa. Yeah, so you can see the irony in that. The next image I'm going to put up.
John, look at the EU building. It's the shape of.
It's the same. It's the same. And Kylie, when she was dancing around just before she had her breast cancer, has got a similar uniform on. You might notice it.
Yeah.
Madonna at the Super Bowl, same kit. It's got the little squares on it that make it look like a Dalek, make it look like a uniform, like Magellan was wearing on the beach when Lapu Lapu got him with the sword, and he became an iconic hero. So what I'm saying is now the next image is of El Nino as the whole world now knows it, which is global warming. So now on my screen, in front of the camera and in front of the listeners, we've got images of the weather patterns that are consuming the globe. And John and I talked this morning about the bizarre weather in America, the massive fault line issues that they are now having in America on the Madrid fault line. So that's a Hispanic fault line. And what I talked to John about this morning was that when the storm swept into the Philippines, about a year ago I think, or it may have been earlier this year, I forget exactly when they had the massive storms in the Philippines, but the damage that was done in the region of the Philippines that were the subject of that, you know, the tornadoes and the massive storms and the tsunami-like event that hit the beachheads there, the place where Lapu Lapu in the Battle of Mactan fought against Magellan on the beach was completely unscathed by that event. All the little village huts were still intact at the end of the massive storm, but the epicenter of that was only 5 miles away. And the Philippines is the big, if you look up Christianity and Christian missions in the Philippines, you'll see that the whole place is consumed by multiple different denominations of the Christian missions and the Christian charities, which we now know are actually frauds. And when Naomi Klein wrote about tsunamis hitting the South Pacific in 2005, when we were living in New Zealand, and I saw the first aid people who were the owners of my house, they were called to the South Pacific shoreline to do the mopping up. And when we went to visit the house that the first aid man ran, it was full of African treasures.
My God.
Yeah. So that's what
Cross.
the Red Cross, the ambulance sector who laundered the gold, and the leaders of the ambulance sector who launched it are Swiss. They're always neutral, but they used it as the laundering tool for the Nazi gold and the illicit capital flight. And now the whole world believes that global warming is real, and the El Ninho, in the form of the bizarre weather patterns, has now displaced completely from the public's mind the concept that El Ninho was the icon for the baby Jesus, and then for the cull of all of the indigenous people on those islands. They were so genial that they smiled as they were shot down. You know the legends about people being welcomed into Fiji, welcomed it all over the South Pacific, and those people are really friendly, but what they got in return was the loss of all of their land, and they were imposed a false religion, which is a really clever story. I've told you about that in previous videos.
George, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Now this is stuff that no one's supposed to know about, isn't it? Let's face it.
Well, you know what it will result in, and we talked about that this morning.
Yeah.
What global warming is doing is, Naomi Klein wrote a really respectable book on the brutalization of Iraq. She called it the shock doctrine, on the things that happened in New Orleans after the second of those massive floods they had.
Yeah.
Naomi Klein helped the world's leaders define the red zone and the green zone. You know, the red zone is the really dangerous place at the battle centres.
Yeah.
And when Cheney and the Pentagon and all the infrastructure people who had got massive contracts for Blackwater and all those big companies that were directly related to the White House and the privatisation of the Pentagon, they swept into Iraq. They were in heavily protected compounds in the red zone. Their commitments to rebuild from the rubble were completely ignored. You know that story?
Go on, George.
Well, they completely ignored their commitments, like G4S ignored its commitments to the Olympics. They took the payment for everything that they negotiated, but they failed to deliver their contracts. So the local people that had, according to Brian Haw, who died mysteriously after campaigning against the wars in the Middle East for 10 years on Parliament Square. He's an Australian.
Oh, yeah.
On his t-shirt it declares openly that 2 million people, bystanders, civilians, people that were in uniform, poorly armed compared to the NATO forces, 2 million people died in Iraq. That man campaigned against the illegitimate wars there on Parliament Square, on Parliament Green for 10 years, lived in a tent, and mysteriously died around the same time as David Kelly and Robin Cook. Yeah, it is brutality of the greatest order. You cannot get more brutal than that. And I believe that Armageddon in the Christian Bible is in the Iraq region. And the two people in Revelations in the Christian Bible that I believed were making a fuss in the face of the evil, the Babylonian evil, were Saddam and Gaddafi. They were heroes for their people, or at least Gaddafi was a hero for his people, because we talked about what he did and what he wanted to protest the other day. Gaddafi realised that the whole of the global wars were about sequestration of the issuance of money in every country that was the host for the battle. And what he wanted to give to his people was the issuance of money and the right to issue money from within Libya. And that meant the price of filling a petrol tank on your off-road vehicle, the massive off-roaders that you see with the machine guns on the back in the Middle East that is now brutalised. In Gaddafi's era, you could fill the tank of one of those massive vehicles for $5 a throw.
No tax.
And none of those forecourt hikes and scams. And what Greg Hallett taught me was that oil is a renewable resource. It's not depleted over time because the dinosaur carcass
comes from below the fossil line. So
that's right. It's generated deep within the Earth's core.
That's right.
And I've now found the literature on that from the Russians, who were suppressed completely in the Cold War period. The research is peerless, and it has been covered up and censored because it's so sensational. So the oil fields that we have in the North Sea will live forever.
Exactly.
The myth that we went to the Falklands to protect our interests there.
Well, we know what that was about.
It's all about geopolitical manipulation.
Exactly.
But the religious fraud is much cleverer than Mrs. Thatcher and even Pinochet. Because people believe that their souls are dependent on it. It has underpinned every religious martyr that has ever existed, all of the genocides, all of the anti-Semitism, and all of the missionary killings and the religious battles and the religious conflicts, which we're now entering into in the form of another messianic religion, which is a fraud according to Abelard Royklin, like Christianity. Those are the Islamic religions. All of them are based on the preface that humans are just as powerful as gods. So the messianic presence of Jesus Christ, of whatever the Islamic icons are, Muhammad, and all of those things, those are stories told by humans and written by humans. And when writing was invented in Canaan, that was the end of the story, and that was when Christianity picked up on the Amen word. I refuse to chant or clap in a church until I understand what I'm chanting. And I explained to you what Amen is all about. It's about one of those ancient Egyptian pharaohs who believed that they were gods, and they built the pyramids so that their carcass could live forever. Wrapped in this, and you see the iconic mysteries of that, and people believe. I don't know whether or not there is an afterlife. I don't know how many gods there are, what their gender is, but I do know that there are gods because I look objectively at what happens in the world when we get volcanoes, we get quakes. I mentioned this morning L'Aquila in Italy. It's had the most frequent earthquakes anywhere on the globe, and it's right next door to a tiny little village called Paganonia. See, God has a sense of humour, and what Silvio Berlusconi and the G8 governments have done in L'Aquila is to put a nuclear plant there. So everything that is human evil. And we talked this morning, I said to you, do you know, because you know that when they brought down the Twin Towers, what they were doing was demonising Islam already. It was the Islamic terrorists that were purported to have done it. We know exactly who did it. We know the involvement of the British Royals. We know the involvement of the US and Canadian Air Forces. And all of that is portrayed as a conspiracy theory. But we also know that Princess Fergie and her husband Prince Andrew, who was the head of the British trade delegation for a whole decade in the lead up to that, were in the town. The red doll joke was shared with the world, and the whole world just swallow it. The red doll is now in the museum. All of the human remains that were micronized, nothing was detectable for the 4,000 people that died in that building. The Jews were told to stay home because, as usual, Mossad and the indigenous American Mossad plants like Kissinger planned the whole thing. Kissinger's the world's biggest killer. He's a German, but he's the highest ranking Mossad agent in the American political team. He won the Peace Prize, but as you know, he's the one that brutalized the whole of the South Pacific, the Golden Triangle. All of those genocidal campaigns were led by him. He's a bigger killer than Stalin, Hitler, Churchill, and the whole lot of them put together.
Definitely.
But he's a Peace Prize winner like Obama, and you know all about Obama's illegitimacy.
Oh, God.
Obama and Barack are also biblical characters. You know that. They're in the Old Testament, and I've told you about Numbers in the Old Testament, where it's just a template for Nazi genocide. So in Numbers in the Old Testament, they shave the victims' heads, they put them in fire pans, and you know the bones are turned to dust. And as a reward, if you fight for the one true God, whichever version of the Bible, whichever chapter you're looking at, the one true God flits around. Sometimes he gives them cancers, sometimes he gives them the plague, sometimes he gives them a famine. But what you get if you're the victor in battle on behalf of the one true God is 32,000 virgins to rape. And they've still got that in the Christian Bible. And when I say to the vicar, you know, why do they keep that in? It's offensive, and we're not allowed to smack our kids. They just say, well, we didn't write the Bible. But when you learn that the Garden of Eden was actually Yemen, and that the Garden of Aden, which was Aden, the British colony, until 1963, when they had the Suez Revolution, and the Egyptians led that, and the Brits bombed Aden to protect the militias there, to kill the Egyptian revolutionaries, and to protect the BP plant.
There you go.
But I just want you to know that the inevitable, unless we intervene and the whole world learns this stuff, the global warming thing is a massive diversion. So Naomi Klein wrote about the red zone in Iraq. She wrote about the floods and the tsunamis and how the charities move in and rob the indigenous peoples blind, displace them of their homes, and replace it with an elite hotel that only George Bush's family can afford to go to. But what she's working on now, can you guess?
Go on.
Global warming and the science behind it.
Fantastic.
Nobody buys into the fact that the God who created the universe can create the bizarre weather patterns that we're seeing all over America, all over that Madrid fault line in America. They're getting hundreds of quakes a week now. And it was on that, you know, some of those posting things that you get about the Operation 21 and already they're running, you know, the camps that they ran in Cuba.
Do you mean Agenda 21?
Yeah, Agenda 21, sorry, So the things that you talk about and the things that you attribute to HAARP, I know that they are acts of God, and way before Tesla was born, God was capable of exploding Vesuvius. He did it twice, as I told you the other day. The second time was in 1945, at the end of the war, when Lucky Luciano, led by Nixon, who negotiated the whole deal, sent the Teamsters from Chicago and the Docklands in America to cull the returning troops who were deprived of their weapons in France and Italy, and they were shot by the mafia leaders from the States. That's the welcome you get when you fight for your country, which is led by fascist leaders who are on the same side.
George, what happens when we get this video to military sources?
Well, you would hope that they will be absolutely indignant. But what the same Nixon did to his troops in Vietnam was to dismember them with narcotics, to dismember them with vice and the introduction of HIV.
That's right.
Into the prostitution dens all around the Golden Triangle. And if you refer your listeners to Henry Kruger's The Great Opium Coup, it reveals the role of the French labs in Marseille, the French leaders like Jacques Foccart, who killed huge numbers of people in French colonial Africa. And he had snuff films and dossiers on all of the sins and all of the presidents and political people in France.
Yeah.
You know, since the beginning of the war, when the French government was run out of bomb-proof Buckinghamshire. They moved into Buckinghamshire in the no-bombing zone between Oxford and Cambridge, and you can see how cynical it is. If French patriots came across the channel, their corpses were buried underneath the basement of the Free French Building. All of that is revealed by Henrik Kruger, and the culls on the returning troops are just as vicious as the genocides in Latin America, which were mainly conducted because the fascists that conducted World War II were allowed to escape into Latin America through Spain and the Canary Islands, which we talked about the other day.
That was a banned book, wasn't it, George? I believe.
Yeah, it was banned in 1980. It is extremely articulate.
1918. Yes, yes.
And
those are the best ones.
And if your listeners want to get a catch up on that really quickly, just get them to look up The Great Opium Coup or Henrik Kruger on my website, which is Prof. George Lee's /Revelations, and look up Kruger and The Great Opium Coup. It is shocking. And that's the same Nixon that was pictured shaking hands warmly with the abdicated king, who went quite safely into Paris for the whole of World War II. They were fans of Hitler. Hitler and Goering attended their wedding. Yeah.
The thing is, George, we still have the same tyrants in power.
Absolutely. And it's uncontested until Greg Hallett came along. But Greg Hallett, as we suspect, has been murdered by the same tyrants with David Cameron's implicit and complicit support.
Exactly.
The lawsuit was taken to David Cameron and to 10 Downing Street. They had to go round to the back building at the back.
And it was recorded.
All of those videos and all of those books and PDFs have been shared with hundreds of thousands of people around the globe. So you can see the inevitable thing.
The shame of it is, George, I bet most of the people listening to this have never even heard of Greg Hallett, let alone you and me.
Well, now that they know about El Nino, I want to explain what the culmination of that will be, unless they rise up and refuse to comply. It will be because of the global warming scam. It's a fraud. There is no science behind it. The weather that we get and the quakes that we get and the tsunamis that we get are acts of God. They've been occurring for centuries and millennia. Yeah? In the South Pacific, you remember what were the films that were made about the East India Company and the massive earthquakes?
There was a brilliant book by Dr. John Coleman, The Committee of 300. It's all about
the Pacific.
Yeah.
Since they dropped the bombs on Japan, an old professor in New Zealand told me this. The Pacific, when he was a boy, was a peaceful place.
Of course.
Beyond World War II, when we had Project Manhattan, the German rocket scientists, the German nuclear physicists went to America to work with the Oppenheimers, and I've told you that Margaret Hodge, the head of the British banking regulators and the FSA regulators, she's an Oppenheimer. Yeah?
Yeah.
All of the technology went into America so that they could brutalise Japan. And you know all about Untermeyer and Brandeis and the imposition of the Japanese by that, the Pearl Harbor attack. The emperor in Japan is still the emperor in Japan. Nothing's changed, as you say. The monarchy in Britain is still the monarchy in Britain. when the king made the king's speech with his IQ of 70, is an imbecile according to Greg Hallett. And that's why the wives that were selected to be with him fled to Scandinavia, and he had to marry in the end a maid from their royal household.
That's right.
Yeah, you remember that story? That's the woman that used to drink gin at the race courses. She was a simple woman. She was loved by the public because she was one of them.
Do you remember the Muppets?
But what I'm going to tell you is the culmination is that Naomi Klein, who I believed, you know, that her book on the shock doctrine and the raping and pillaging of innocent countries that were victims of the quakes or the tsunamis, and the dispossession of the people of their land, and what happened in New Orleans was obscene. The elite people in New Orleans got to do all the land grabs. They got private medicine really, really quickly. The indigenous blacks were just left to starve. Their homes were never paid for. There were no insurance policies. It just became a ghetto. But what Naomi Klein now does is research on global warming.
Yeah.
And I believe she's an insider, deceitful person, because she now posts on left-wing Labour Party propaganda events, and when I tell the truth about the presence on the court of the Bank of England of Dave Prentice, the union leader, none of that gets published because it's blocked by the editor. That's the left-wing news vents. Yeah? So Naomi Klein now writes about the science and the human consumption issues, the carbon credits issues, that gives humans a conscience all over the impoverished world, which is impoverished only because of the tyrants who will not let democracy issue its own money. Instead it lends to them. Every country on the globe and every local council on the globe or district authority is in debt to private lenders, and we know who they are. It's the same people that have been in the monarchies and in that Jewish Christian sect that wrote the Piso story in Rome and in Naples. And when I asked you this morning, where did they sail from to go to the last UN summit before they brought down the Twin Towers? You did not know the answer to that this morning, but you now know it.
Go on.
Genoa.
Yep.
Where Christopher Columbus left for America. And globalism is a massive triumph for them. But for every country across the globe, and it's Lyndon B. LaRouche and his research that informed me of this, all of them have lost their sovereignty, so that the Governor General in Australia and New Zealand is more powerful than any elected official in that country. They just still work for the Crown Templar. And Greg told us how American taxis come to HRH the Queen in the City of London, which has been an island, a tax haven in our country, which is immune from the country's constitution and law enforcement since the Magna Carta was signed. It's ever so clever. But what the scamsters will do now, because we're consuming too much, we're producing too much CO2, carbon dioxide, that's the carbon credits issue that are discussed at conferences that take in every scientist across the globe, and huge diversions of funds into the science behind human energy consumption. What they're going to do next is impose a carbon tax, i.e. a tax on breathing for every poor citizen across the globe, like VAT. Like the death duties that we talked about in the corruption in the legal sector. Even in a tiny little country like Scotland, it is hopelessly corrupted in the legal sector. Which is why I can't get a solicitor to represent me, because I understand their corruption, and when I write to them and say, is this a conflict, they acknowledge that it is. And that's related to prime ministers in this country and dukes and duchesses who sent people to the colonies for stealing bread 200 years ago. That's the colonies that are now equally corrupted.
The problem is, George, these families are still at it, and their names and addresses are out there published.
Yeah.
So there's going to be big problems.
Well, I mean, I believe that, you know, what is happening now, and that people like us, who you didn't have the confidence to make a video 3 weeks ago, but I'm bloody glad I persuaded you to do it, because if you start making new, you know, discussions with your mates in other areas, and you begin, what you've learned about your police commissioner in your region in the last 2 days is quite shocking, but I think we should make a separate video about that.
It's beyond.
But if you want to get the people's thirst up to know a little bit more about that, you could give some of the keywords. What's the woman's name? The commissioner in...
Hedrington?
No, it wasn't. It was Bourne. Katie Bourne.
Oh, Katie Bourne. I was thinking of the other one.
And the other one that we were...
Her mother's a baroness.
Yeah. And the people...
But the thing is, George, I'd rather we did a separate one just on that.
Well, it was just I wanted to drop in the name. We talked a little bit about socialism in that video.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to drop in the name, the Beast of Bolsover, who's involved with the woman who's the spokesperson for Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, who's talking up austerity for the British police. She's talking about sacking more and more British police, eroding their pensions, because there's no money at the Treasury. We understand why there's no money at the Treasury, and that will be the topic of our next video. We'll stop that one now.
This is good timing, George, because it's not too long, and I've got to go anyway.
And just before I close, I'm going to put up for the audience again the image of El Ninho, which is the Jesus icon. And when you think about what's happened to all of the indigenous peoples since then, none of them are left breathing. Yet Christianity is everywhere, and every time you see a quake or a tsunami, have a look at what's going on there in terms of human behaviours, and soon it will make sense.
Fantastic, George.
Okay, I'll stop that one now. Yeah.
Yeah.